Hi, I'm Jeannette Caines. I'm here from Jewelry Arts Inc. in New York City, and I'm going to show you the easiest and the fastest way to both make your granules and to lay them out and to get them to stick. An important step when you're going to make granules on your block is to carve a little trough along the edge. If you've ever made granules before, you know that sometimes when you're melting them, they tend to roll. And this just keeps them in the little trough rather than rolling across the table and you losing them. And those granules are precious, so you don't want to do that. I often do this over a garbage can, just so you know, so that you keep everything nice and clean. The trough does not need to be deep at all. Like what I'm doing right here is fine. It's just enough to be a little barrier and to catch your granules if they start to roll. And you also notice I'm not trying to make them perfect and straight. You could certainly use a ruler if you wanted them to be really pristine, but that's not really necessary for the purpose. However, make sure the little trough doesn't run off the edge, or else it's not going to serve your purpose very well. There's a few different ways to make granules. You can try them all and just see what you find easiest. Something I like to do is I take my 22 karat wire and I take a wood dowel. I just have a little hole drilled in the end. I can poke my wire through just a little and wrap it around just like I'm making links for a chain. Because what that's going to do is that's going to give me granules all the same size. Now I'm only using this method if I want relatively large granules. I'll show you how big these are when I cut it. I know relatively large is an extremely relative term, but okay, so then I'm going to cut off my little tab right there so that I can slide my little coil off. And I'm going to grab it and pull it out. That way, I can just slide my little coil like that. I'll cut it with my scissors. And then I can just sprinkle them right on my block. I'll take out the ones that are incomplete circles and I'll just spread them out a little bit so that hopefully when I melt them they won't run all together. When you want to melt your granules, you don't want to use an enormous tip and you don't want it turned up too high, otherwise they'll tend to roll too far across the table. You'd really just keep the heat steady right on top and it forms a perfect little ball. Is that not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? Liquid metal gives you that beautiful surface tension, and that's what makes it make that perfect circle, which is why I don't roll my granules off a slanted block, and I also don't dig a little hole. A little tiny flat on the bottom of your granule is only going to help you to lay it out. So this is how I do all of my granules, just like this. It's an absolutely mesmerizing procedure. I've melted a billion granules in my life, and yet I still find it endlessly fascinating. You'll notice that the color is a little bit dark now because there's a little copper in my alloy and it's oxidized. So after it's cooled a bit, then I'm going to pickle them. One technique that we've been using a lot to get very small, very consistent granules is actually to use a hole punch. I mill out my 22 karat quite thin. This happens to be 30 gauge, but you could go even thinner if you have smaller granule needs. And what I do is I just vary the thickness of my metal depending on the size of the granule that I want. Okay, so these are going to make the most beautiful little tiny granules you've ever seen. Now, not everybody likes to go crazy and make the little ones like I do, but if you're going to work on a 3D surface in particular, you absolutely have to use such small granules because otherwise gravity will really not help you. Now what I normally do is I don't really make the exact amount of granules that I need for a particular project. You'll go crazy if you're sitting there trying to add. Now you notice that I didn't do that on purpose, but what does happen sometimes is if they roll a little bit, two will roll together. If I have two that rolled together, all that means is I have an extra size to use, so I don't worry about it too much. I just filter them out when I'm done. But I tend to, on a day where maybe I'm not feeling particularly motivated, I'll just make a bunch of granules and have them ready to go. I don't like to sit there and count because it seems like that's a way to go crazy. Since I make a lot of granules and I really don't want to have to pick up each of these little tiny granules all by itself, what I normally do is this really low-tech technique here. I let my granules cool for a couple minutes. Important note, let them cool. You don't want to set your paper plate on fire. But then I can just pick up my block and just gently tilt them all like so. It's a real time saver when you're making a lot of small granules. So what I do is I just fold up my paper plate and I'm going to slide them right into a little plastic tea strainer. It's a whole lot easier for me to put these right in the pickle like this, and that way I didn't lose a single granule, and I can just seal it up and put it in my pickle pot. The tea strainer that I use is completely plastic. You wouldn't want to get anything metal that could possibly interfere with your pickle, so just make sure whatever tea strainer you get, it's 100% plastic. Now, if you need larger granules and you're not so concerned about them all being the exact same size, normally what I would do is I would just take shears. I would cut either my sheet or my wire. It doesn't really matter, whatever you feel like you have more of, into just sort of irregular squares, and then I'll melt them on my block. The larger granules are going to have a little larger flat on the bottom, but that just makes them easier to position, so I don't really worry about it. And if you don't like the size of the granules that you made, you can just move to a heavier wire or a heavier sheet, or you can also just put two together. I'll show you that as well. So for example, if I need just a larger one in one particular spot, I can just pick up a couple of these and make sure they're touching each other and just remelt. You can always add more to granules, you really just can't take away. As you see, and it just makes a nice big granule. These are my granules now. They've been pickled and rinsed in water. Now the next step is going to be copper plating, which is very important for your granulation. I'm using used pickle, which already has copper dissolved in it. If you think about every time you heat something up and it oxidizes and you pickle it, you're getting that copper in the solution. As long as you can see at least a faint sort of blue-green blush to your pickle, it's fine to use. So what I've done is I've scooped some out into either a Pyrex dish or a plastic dish. I've submerged my tea strainer with my granules in it, and I have a pair of nice rusty tweezers. Now you can use binding wire or you can use tweezers. Just make sure you don't use tweezers that are so shiny and new and chrome plated that there's not actually any iron to interact. Now I'm going to slide it down in there. You don't have to touch every granule by any means, but kind of just make contact a bit. And you see how you're getting that nice rosy pink color? That's your copper granulation happening. And that's all it takes. Now, if your pickle is a little colder, it might happen a little slower. You're really just watching for that visual cue of seeing them get that little bit of a rosy color. That's all you need. They don't need to be heavily copper plated. You just need to be able to see it by eye. What I would do now is I'll take it out, rinse it in the water, and then my next stage is to get ready to start setting it up on my piece. Okay, now that I have my granules, they're all beautifully copper plated and they're waiting off to the side, I'm going to start preparing my back sheet. The first thing that I usually do is take my tweezers or maybe my chain nose pliers and just turn up a little handle. That's going to be incredibly essential later when you're putting this in and out of the kiln. You want to have something that's easy to hold on to. So I'm going to do a process now called depletion gilding or enriching. All it really means is I'm going to anneal my back sheet and pickle it. I'm going to do that 2 or 3 times. What I'm doing is I'm removing the copper from the surface and leaving just pure gold and maybe a little bit of silver at the surface. So when you're annealing, you know, you use a nice soft flame, not too hard. Keep it moving. I'm going to work my way around the piece. Now this is 22 karat gold. It doesn't have an enormous amount of copper in it, so it's not going to get very dark, but I'm just going to gently work my way around till I see a little bit of that color change that tells me it's annealed. And you can see it's getting just a little bit darker than it was. You know, this is not like sterling where it's going to turn very, very black. And if I'm trying to really get all the copper to come up to the surface, I might pause just for a second or two and then go back in. Okay, that'll do nicely. I'm going to let it cool, and then I'm going to pickle it. I'm just going to repeat the process once or twice. Ideally, what I like to do is I like to do it until when I heat it up, it really doesn't get dark anymore. It just has that nice gold color. The concept behind granulation is colloidal hard soldering. It's really a localized alloy. So we've copper plated our granules and we've enriched our backsheet. So we've got some pure copper on the surface of our granules and we've got a very pure surface on our sheet. Now the pure copper and the pure gold together are going to melt together at a slightly lower temperature than the 22 is going to fuse to the 22. So even though you don't have to do the copper plating and enriching to get an attachment, you're going to get a much cleaner, tidier attachment, because the whole goal is to get that beautiful little neck of metal between the granule and the backsheet without the whole piece starting to look a little melty. So that's why we do it, and it's essential really for getting a fine effect. Also, I'm going to take a toothbrush and a little dishwashing soap and give it a scrub and keep my fingerprints off my granules and off my surface. Any kind of finger oils can seriously impede your fusing process. So once you get to this stage, you really want to keep everything very nice and clean. Now what I've done is I've laid just a little pile of granules. You want to keep them wet. You really can't lay them out. If they get dry, they'll just sort of roll away. So I've got a little fine sable brush, I've got just a little water in here, and I can play around with them and do any kind of arrangement. If you ever worked with granulation, you know they love to form little triangles, which is why you see so much triangle patterns in granulation. You can make little rosettes with a granule in the middle and granules around it, whatever makes you happy. You can also just arrange them a little more randomly. If you want just little granules, you know, here and there, sort of sprinkled over the surface, anything you want to do. You want to complete all of this with the water before you think about using your glue, which I'll be showing you just in a moment. Now, when you're laying out your granules, you definitely should try to relax and not stress out. It's like kind of like painting a picture. You want to get everything exactly where you want them to be. Now I've just done sort of a random arrangement here. I'm not going to bother to do a whole complicated scene, but I think you can see that with just a little fine brush and water, you can place them pretty easily. If you're using much larger granules, you might use your tweezers a little bit if you need to pick them up. But normally medium to small, you can just use a fine brush like this, and they're really easy to operate. So once I have everything exactly the way I want it to be, then I can think about starting to glue. Now the glue that I'm going to use is an organic glue called Hide glue. That's H-I-D-E. You can get it online or at a lot of hardware stores because fine furniture makers use it. The important point is that it's an organic glue. So if we use a relatively small amount of it, it'll burn away completely in the kiln and it won't impede your fusing, but it will hold the granules in place. You know, the whole point to the glue is keeping the granules where you want them on the way to the kiln and to stay there until you have a chance to fuse them and get them attached. So let's say that this is exactly the design that I have always dreamed of, which this is a little random, but we'll pretend. I've got one drop of my Hide glue right there. I often use the high-tech method of my finger to apply drops. It's 1 drop of Hide glue to 12 drops of water. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You'll notice when we're doing this process that I'm going to be using a very dilute glue solution. This is absolutely one of those situations where more glue is not better. Too much glue and it won't burn off cleanly. And then everything will kind of have a funny residue, which can keep it from fusing. Also, when you're burning it off, if there's too much, it can bubble up and move all your carefully laid granules into a different position, which is enough to make you very sad. So my 12 drops of water, my 1 drop of glue, I use my brush just to mix it together like that. And I'm getting ready to apply my glue. Now, when you get ready to apply your glue, take a look at your granules. If you're in a warm room or just a little time has gone by and the water has evaporated from your granules, you're going to want to re-add a little bit of water. The key is that the granules are wet, and then when I apply a very little amount of glue, just like that, it'll disperse in the water, so you'll get a very fine, very even coating of glue everywhere. If the granules become dry, you'll actually end up with too much glue, and like I said, that can cause you a lot of troubles down the road. And most of the time, the problem that people have with glue is they just apply too much glue because they want to be sure everything sticks, which is totally understandable, but it actually doesn't work that way. You really just want a very minimal little amount. Like that. So my next stage, I usually just dry this next to a warm kiln, or you can just really leave it sitting, out of the way for a little bit, because you don't want to think about putting it in the kiln until it's 100% dry. If there's any moisture whatsoever, you'll put it in the kiln, your tiny bit of water will instantly boil, and all your carefully laid granules will fling everywhere, and then you're very sad. Now I'm going to talk to you about granulating on a curved surface. Things get a little trickier. One of the most common problems that people have is they say, I'm trying to put my granules on my dome and they keep sliding down. Most of the time what that means is you're just using too large of a granule. There's only so much we can do to overcome gravity. So when you're working on a dome, you see these crazy tiny little granules? This is the kind of size that you need to have. Most people, what they're doing is they're trying to apply larger ones, and they'll just roll down the side and roll down the side. Now, another way you can get your granules to roll down the side is if you add an enormous amount of water. So for example, like right there, you see they're clinging, no problem. If I start to add a whole bunch of water and move them around, you see what I mean? They'll start to sort of slide down the side. All I usually do then is kind of dry my brush off and absorb a little bit of the extra water. I'll use just a little piece of paper towel. To take off most of the water. Now this is otherwise really going to be very similar to how we laid out granules on a flat surface. We're going to use the glue solution on our wet granules once everything is exactly the way we want it to be. I'm not going to waste your time doing a crazy complicated pattern. I'm just going to do sort of a little irregular stuff on top here. Everybody has their own ideas of what they want their granulation to look like. But let's say I want to do something like that. Now that's nice and wet. We talked before about using hide glue. The only difference is when you're working on a curved surface, you want to add a little something extra to the glue so that it'll hold it in place once the glue completely burns away. Because when you're on a curved surface like this and the glue completely burns away, they can start to slide down the side in the kiln, which will make you very sad. So what I'm going to do is just add 1 drop of regular liquid flux to my glue solution, just like that. Well, that was more like a half drop, so maybe I'll apply 2. There we go. And I'm going to mix it all together, and that's just going to give me that little extra bit of hold to keep them in place after the glue burns off. So just like with any granulation, you actually want a super minimal amount of glue. I'm going to just touch it in a few little places, just like that. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I drink a lot of coffee. And my hands shake. So I am always bracing my hands and getting really comfortable with my wrist on the bench, because otherwise if you're trying to hold your hand up in the air, you definitely get a lot more wiggling. Maybe all of you have wonderful steady hands, but I just like to compensate for all my coffee use. So just like the other granulation, I've got my glue on there now. Then I would just let it dry completely before I put it in the kiln. Once I'm absolutely certain my granules are all dry, once I'm sure they're dry, I wait 5 more minutes. I'm going to pick it up carefully, keeping it level, using my little handle, and I'm going to place it in the kiln. Yes, everything is glued in place, but you don't really want to push it by shaking it around or dropping it. You want to put it flat on the surface of the kiln and then let go with your tweezers. And you can see all the glue burning off. You start to get a little brownish black, and you can see it sort of disappearing. Before we begin to granulate, we're going to let that disappear. When you're granulating, in general, you want to use a large, soft flame. I'm using a Smith No. 1 tip, and if you're in doubt on which to use, generally it's better to go with the larger tip with a softer flame. You can see that this is more like an annealing flame rather than a soldering flame. You don't want to hear much hiss, and you want the end to be a little fluttery. Now that my glue is burned away, I'm going to use my nice, soft, fluffy flame, like a pencil, straight up and down, and I'm going to start heating up the whole piece. What I'm looking for is for the attachments between the granule and the back sheet, the spots where they make contact, to be brighter than everything else. We're approaching that, but we're not there yet. And there we are. And then I really go in with my feather tip. I keep it moving. And that is going to form all those beautiful little attachments that you're hoping for. I think that's done now. I'm going to take it out of the kiln, let it cool, I'll pickle it, and then I'm going to examine it closely and make sure I have a good attachment. If everything goes beautifully, they're all fused the first time. Occasionally you have to put it back in because one or two are still loose. In that case, we just set it up again with a little water and a little glue, and we just put it in the kiln again and fuse. I hope this helped. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call.